Hi guys, it's Shane, and welcome back to what has now been rebranded as the Armchair F1 YouTube channel because my name just wasn't working for me. Um, Today we're going to do something a little bit different from some of my other videos. Instead of it just being the long-haired idiot rants about Formula One for 10 minutes, we're actually going to go through it and we're going to look through some data to see what the data tells us regarding certain aspects of Formula One. So what we're looking at here is the pace difference between teammates in qualifying. Now, some ground rules for the way I collected the data. We are going to be taking the fastest legal lap from the last session that both drivers set a lap time in qualifying. So, if only one driver makes it through to Q2, we will be taking the fastest time both drivers set in qualifying one. And likewise, if only one driver makes it to Q3 and both of them are in Q2, it will be the fastest time from Q2. The reason for this is it is unfair to take a driver's lap from a later period in the weekend due to the way that the track develops with it rubbering in and then finding more grip. So it will be the fastest lap from the last session they both set lap times in. No times in qualifying one will get the entire weekend disqualified from the overall time delta average, but will not get it disqualified from the teammate head to head. I will still go over what the head to heads would have been without the no times, but from the overall teammate head to head, it will be completely it will still count. So if a driver doesn't put a time in Q1, he still lost that weekend to his teammate. However, on the pace delta, it will mean that there is one less weekend to count towards the average. So instead of it being an average across 9 races, it's an average across 8. Finally, no races will be removed due to what I perceive as an anomalous result. So no result that sticks out like blatantly to me over my experience collecting data through experiments via my degree and my A levels. No piece of data that looks like it is not supposed to be there is being discounted. So, for example, this is Bottas in Baku, this is Perez in Spain and Monaco, this is Daniel Ricciardo in Portugal. This is like these will still be counted towards the average. The only exception to this rule is I have counted Lance Stroll's time in the 2 minutes in France as a non-time. I believe it was France. It was indeed France, because that is a clear and obvious difference where it was an abandoned lap, not an actual lap time. That for me, I put down as a no time for Stroll. Final rule, the final thing is these teammates, the teammates will be ranked. The overall difference will be ranked as from closest to biggest gap. So the closest gap will be number 1, and the biggest gap will be number 10. With all of the ground rules established, let's jump into the ratings. And a somewhat unsurprising one at number 10, we all thought this was going to happen, is Mick Schumacher beating Nikita Mazepin by the widest margin. He is 8-1 up. The only time he was beaten was at Monaco, where he didn't set a lap time in qualifying. So this is an average across 8 races. However, the average gap is 0.482 seconds. That is nearly half a second. That's a big gap. Like we were expecting Mick to outperform Nikita, but that's a large gap on average. That's a large gap on the day, let alone as an average across 8 races. That's a big difference. And now we get into the slightly more surprising ones. The ninth biggest gap, the ninth smallest gap, the second largest gap between teammates is at AlphaTauri, and it's the gap between Pierre Gasly and Yuki Tsunoda. Now, this is an average across 7 races, so there is more chance for an anomaly to throw it out, because Yuki has not set a lap time on 2 occasions this season. I will double check where they were. He failed to set a lap in Imola, and he failed to set a lap in France. However, he has still been beaten 9-0 by his teammate. He has been beaten at every weekend in qualifying. He's being George Russell right. He's being George Russell right now, absolutely massacring his teammate, but being massacred by his teammate. And the average gap is 0.437 seconds. That's large. That's a big. Likewise with the Haas boys, that is only half a tenth smaller than the gap between the 2 Haas teammates. That's still a very large gap. Obviously Yuki's a rookie, he's still learning, but that's still, for a driver known for his pace and his racecraft has proved to be very, very good. And he is getting closer now, but that's still a very big gap. 8th, and this was the big shock for me, and I checked this one multiple times. The 8th biggest gap between teammates is at Red Bull between Max and Checo. Max is 8-1 up in qualifying. The only time he was outqualified by his teammate being Imola, where Sergio put it on the front row. The gap on average is 0.421 seconds. That is massive for Red Bull. Like they wanted Albon between in that 3/10 gap, and at the moment Perez isn't there. Admittedly, he would be. The two anomalies that I mentioned at the start, Spain and Monaco, if we discount those, he's still an average of 0.67 seconds slower without Monaco and Spain. But that's still a large gap. And we'll talk about that when we talk about other anomalies that we have discounted that just look out of place. It's a very big gap between teammates. Even with the anomalous discounted, they're still only the 6th closest teammates. They still have the 5th biggest gap between their teammates. I don't think we can look into it too much because of Checo's race performances, but in qualifying pace, Max has had him. Max has had him for breakfast. And we're like 8-1 up. This is very, very, very dominant from Max. 7th, and I could not believe this was as close as it was with the data I used, Williams. I thought this might be the biggest gap. I genuinely expected George to be light years ahead of Latifi, but no. He is 0.37 seconds on average from Latifi. This has been massively helped by, it was one of the 2 Austrian races. It was, where was it? I have it in my notes. It wasn't Austria, it was France, where Latifi was only 2 thousandths slower than George in qualifying 1. So that has dropped this gap a little bit, but still, as an average over 9 races, a less than 4/10 gap is still smaller than I expected for the difference in quality we know is there between the drivers. And obviously, George has whitewashed him in qualifying. That is the second 9-0 and the last 9-0. 6th, and this is one that I learned purely while doing the research for this video, is Alfa Romeo. There is a much bigger gap between the Alfa Romeo teammates than I thought. Giovinazzi has flattened Kimi this season compared to where I thought it was. I thought this was a lot closer. Giovinazzi is on average 0.347 faster than Kimi Raikkonen, and has beaten him 7-2 in qualifying, with him having it would be 7-1 without his no time in Baku, I believe. Where was it for Alfa Romeo? It was Baku, where Giovinazzi did not set a time. Still 7-2 up in qualifying, and with an average pace advantage across 8 races of just over a third of a second. That's a much bigger gap than I thought. Gio is doing very well against Kimi Raikkonen. 5th is one that everyone's been talking about recently, the gap between Lando Norris and Daniel Ricciardo. At the moment, Lando is is ahead on average by 0.312 seconds. He's 6-3 up in qualifying, but the interesting here is that Ricciardo was actually quicker in 3 of the first 4 sessions of the season. He was quicker in Bahrain, Imola, and in Spain in qualifying. We are not talking about Norris's disallowed lap because I said at the start, if the lap was disallowed for track limits, it doesn't count, right? So it was close. Admittedly, he was only he was like half a tenth, and then 4/10 up in Spain. But some of the gaps behind Lando, a second slower in the Algarve, half a second in Monaco, 7/10 in Baku, 5/10 in Styria, 3/10 in the Austrian weekend. There have been some big gaps between Lando and Ricciardo, especially recently, which has led to Lando being a fairly sizable chunk ahead on average, and leaving McLaren as the 4th closest teammates. And now we get into the top 4 and the teammate pairing that everyone's talking about. Hamilton and Bottas. On average, this is a gap of 0.184. Hamilton 6-3 up in qualifying, with Bottas outqualifying him in Portugal, in Monaco, and on time, not on grid position, in Styria, because he did outqualify Hamilton on pace but got the grid penalty. And because his lap was quicker, it does count towards this. This has been talked about as Bottas being miles behind Hamilton and costing Mercedes the championship. On qualifying pace, doesn't appear to be the case. Even more so if we were to discount Baku. Now, the reason I am discounting Baku and not discounting Monaco for Hamilton and Imola for Bottas is Monaco and Imola actually cancel one another out because it was a very similar time gap. But Baku is the anomaly in this series. If you discount Baku, this gap drops to a gap of 0.063, or the second closest pair of teammates, which is even more impressive from Valtteri Bottas when you consider that the teammate he is barely half a tenth slower than, on average, across 8 races, is a 7-time world champion with over 100 pole positions. It becomes infinitely more impressive that way. But, of course, this is the overall average, so we have to include Baku, and it is a 0.184. That is still the fourth closest set of teammates. And overall, very, very, very good for Bottas, and Hamilton has once again been beating his teammate. Third, we have Ferrari with Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz. Leclerc 6-3 up in qualifying in the head-to-head, and 0.140 up on average with the data. That is remarkably close between these two. We know these are both quality drivers. We know these drivers are both fantastic, and we're having a lot of fun with Ferrari having two genuinely good drivers. I'm not surprised to see those two this close. Second closest is going to surprise a few people. It's actually Aston Martin. So Vettel is 5-4 up in qualifying. This is sort of thrown because Lance has on 2 occasions failed to set either a lap time or a represented lap time. As I've said, I'm discounting his France because it was in the 2 minutes. It just doesn't count. Does not, in no way is indicative of the data. It would send the average out by thousands of percent. Like, if we included France, his pace delta to Vettel would be in the seconds, which is ridiculous. With both drivers counted, it's 5-4 to Vettel, but in the 7 races for the average, Stroll is actually 4-3 up, which makes sense when you look at the average time, where Stroll is actually 0.074 up on Vettel. It's a very small gap. It's like 3/4 of a tenth of a second. That is a small gap. Vettel is learning the car and is improving, but it is nice for Aston Martin to see that both of their drivers are relatively close to one another, even if it is probably indicative that neither of them is particularly getting their head around qualifying right now, considering Stroll doesn't have a great reputation as a qualifier unless it's raining. Finally, the closest team, if the only one left, is Alpine. Now, Alpine have been they have been all over the place with the gaps, because some of the gaps between their drivers have been massive, but they have swung both ways. So Ocon is 5-4. Alonso is 5-4 up in qualifying in the head-to-head, but on the average pace delta, Ocon is marginally faster at 0.047 seconds faster on average. That is because his gaps over Alonso have been bigger than Alonso's gaps over him. Obviously, Ocon has also dropped a lot closer to Alonso on the average with his difficult weekends in Austria, but it's still the closest teammate pairing with the data we had. With the data we used, this is the closest pair of teammates. This data has told me that some teammates are a lot closer than we thought, and the gaps between some teammates are genuinely enormous on average. I did not think that Perez was further behind Max than Latifi was behind Russell. I thought Bottas was close to Hamilton, but when you take out the anomaly to know he's the second closest to his teammate, and his teammate is Lewis Hamilton, that's remarkably good work from Bottas on a Saturday. Again, only if we discount Baku. It's still really good to be less than 2 tenths on average behind your teammate, who is world class, with a really bad weekend in there as well. And I think the big shock for me as well is Latifi being a lot closer to George than we all give him credit for. But so this has been a different video. This is where I've used the data to say the story rather than my opinion, rather than just being me ranting based on what I think as a fan. It's more what the timesheets tell us, because the timesheets are ultimately the things they are the things that dictate everything in Formula One. That's all that matters. So this has been the Saturday average pace thing. Let me know in the comments, but I'm considering doing, and I'll probably be doing the research for over the next few hours and probably into tomorrow, over whether I should do one with the average gap between teammates at the end of the race, when both drivers finish. So to give us an idea of how the drivers are stacking up against one another on a Sunday in comparison to their teammates and the rest of the grid in the way that the teams are spread on Sundays, because obviously Sunday is where the points are scored. Let me know if you've learned anything from this video with the way that the statistics have told a story, with obviously Haas being the biggest gap and Mercedes being a lot closer between their cars than Red Bull are between theirs, proving perhaps that Red Bull do have a genuine pace advantage to still be able to be ahead in the constructors despite the clear gap. But we will know more about that when I do the video on the average gaps come the end of a race. Any other thoughts or feedback you'd like to give me, whether you prefer these or the more ranty videos, please let me know in the comments. And until next time, I have been Shane Nye, and I will see you next time.